All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Carmel Shachar. I'm the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health, Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our event today, a macro view of microdosing. Before I start talking about the event itself, a few housekeeping items, the equivalent of where the bathrooms are in the virtual space. So the second half of this event will be a moderated discussion between our panelists. And so not only are we okay with you submitting questions, we actually strongly encourage you to submit questions so that I can pose them to our panelists. The best way to submit questions by far and away is to use the Q&A feature found in the meeting controls at the bottom of your screen. So you scroll down, there's a little Q&A box, click it, submit. You may not be able to see the question queue because you're in attendee view, but I promise you it's there. I will be monitoring that. You're also welcome to join the conversation or submit questions on Twitter. We're at Petrie-Flom. You can use the hashtag POPLAR. Again, that's hashtag POPLAR. We're excited to engage with you on Twitter. If you have a question that you pose on Twitter, center staff will take it, pull it, put it into the Zoom Q&A feature. If you have any technical issues, on the other hand, and I hope that you won't, please email petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu. Again, that's petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu. That is going to be by far and away the best way to get our attention when there is a problem. Now, if you like this event, I really hope that you do, and you are interested in our other work, I strongly encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. It comes out only twice a month, so we do not clog your inbox, and it'll let you know what events are happening, what is happening on our blog, what scholarship our affiliates are putting out. Speaking of our blog, I strongly encourage you to read Bill of Health. It's our blog that brings you really accessible but nuanced and well thought out views on major health law policy questions, bioethics, current events. Right now, we're running actually a digital symposium on microdosing. So if you're intrigued by this, please check that out. As well as please check out some of our other events. For example, on 4/20, we will be having an event, Neuroscience and Cannabis, Implications for Law and Policy, that might be of interest. As well as we have a full slate looking at issues such as how Medicaid programs can take leadership on bringing serious illness care into the home. When prisoners have health issues, who gets to make those medical decisions? And how do we allocate scarce medical resources? So please check that out. With all of that being said, I'm excited now to dive into the meat of the substance, the meat of the matter, so to speak. So we are here today to talk about microdosing, which I think has a really interesting place in the psychedelics renaissance that we've been seeing. I think microdosing, which has various definitions, that's something that we will certainly talk about, what is a microdose, has captured the imagination as a way to treat conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, treatment-resistant depression, and in some ways, frankly, may feel perhaps more accessible and less scary to people who have not had prior psychedelics experience. But there are a lot, I think, of questions raised, both what would a regulatory system that would support and allow for microdosing look like? What might actually constitute a microdose, and how can the scientific and medical community help inform that? Whether there are risks and drawbacks of microdosing, as there are for virtually every treatment. We're going to explore a whole host of perspectives and give you really some food for thought. But to start with, we have, I think, a real treat for you. It's not a micro treat, it's a macro treat. And I promise that's the only pun of its nature I will make throughout this entire event. But we are very lucky to have Dr. James Bademan give the keynote before we turn to our panel discussion. He has been dubbed the father or godfather of microdosing. His 2011 book, The Psychedelics Explorer's Guide, is one of the foundational pieces on microdosing, in fact. It put the practice on the map for many. It set out what has become one of the most popular microdosing schedules and is in many ways, I think, responsible for the dramatic increase in the media and scientific attention on microdosing we've seen over the last 10 years, but especially building up recently in the last several years. He has collected thousands of reports regarding people's attempts to microdose, and I think his research really places him as one of the foremost experts on microdosing. Dr. Fadiman, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to turn the stage over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to return to Harvard. It's been a long time, and I actually was not sure I'd ever be invited back. So it is very nice to be here. And I will be going over really a lot of what was just suggested as an outline. But because I will probably not be able to get in everything I want to tell you, I want to start with the kind of data that I work with. And this is, I like to have things that are fresh. So this came in yesterday, and it may help us, particularly when we're looking at research that shows that microdosing has very little effect. So this is from someone. Showers felt so hard. Taking the dog outside felt hard. Cooking felt hard. I can do these things with no problem now. I even cleaned my whole place this weekend. I've had an exceptionally stressful few weeks at work, and I dove in head first instead of hiding in bed with French fries crying. I have a vision for my future, and 2 months ago didn't even want to live in the future. Now, that's someone who has microdosed, and it's the kind of data that I've been looking at for the past 10 years, and it continues to excite me that this is possible for whatever reason and whatever way. And for this person, their life has been clearly improved, or shifted at least, with microdosing. So what is microdosing, as we say? What I said was that it's small doses of psychedelics taken intermittently for healing mental and physical conditions or enhanced wellness. Now, then I looked on Reddit last night. Reddit has a subedit that we'll talk about later, and I like theirs much better. Microdosing involves taking a minuscule dose of a psychedelic substance, usually 5 to 10% of a regular dose, with the intention of increasing the quality of your life. I like that because it's technical in terms of how much. It's sufficiently broad, so it doesn't say it's about illness or wellness. And I like the word minuscule. So what are the substances that people are taking? Predominantly, this is like 90 to 95%, LSD and psilocybin containing mushrooms. There's also people using mescaline from natural sources, mainly the cactus San Pedro, and not yet published, but getting widely, a lot of wide interest is Banisteriopsis caapi, which is the vine part of ayahuasca, and surprisingly Amanita muscaria, which is the Christmas mushroom. And there will be a book out in August looking at 3,000 cases of people using Amanita muscaria. It's particularly surprising because if you look in mushroom books, it's considered toxic. And in high doses, it absolutely is. And there's others, but that's enough for now. How much? How much is minuscule? LSD, approximately 7 to 12 micrograms, that's millionths of a gram. With mushrooms, 0.1, a tenth of a gram to 4/10 of a gram. That depends on people's need and experience, as well as what species of mushroom, and similar amounts of a lot of other substances. So there are protocols, as we call them, which is how often people use. And one that I developed actually for research, which has become popular in spite of everything I could do, is 1 day on, taking a microdose, and then 2 days off, so that most of the time you are not using a microdose. There's another protocol, which is every other day. Another protocol from Paul Stamets, which is either 4 or 5 days on and either 3 or 2 days off. And I said to Paul, wait a moment, which is it? He said, you can't be too rigid. And I thought, okay, that is indeed working with the way human beings are, not the way we are when we're being researchers. Now, part of the protocol is taking longer breaks, maybe a week, even a month, if one is using microdoses over a long time. Why? To ensure there's no buildup of tolerance, which is, tolerance is when the effect becomes less. And also to determine if people's goals have been reached and they can be maintained without microdosing. The goal of microdosing is to use it less, in smaller amounts, and less often. It's very different than a lot of other pharmaceuticals. So there is a history. Mushrooms and peyote have been used in high doses for literally thousands of years, predating a lot of Western civilization. And low uses, microdoses, we have a certain amount of evidence, but it's sufficiently ordinary in the lives of the people using mushrooms predominantly, that we don't have a lot of description. But we do have some lovely descriptions of Aztecs taking it for parties, mixed with chocolate, by the way. So, and Ibogaine, which is from Gabon, Africa, it's used now for working with people with very serious addictions. But in the 1930s in France, you could buy it in a pharmacy. It was sold as a general kind of tonic or stimulant. So the current rediscovery, of which I'm a part, Albert Hoffman, who synthesized LSD and synthesized psilocybin, took microdoses, a little higher than microdoses, late in his life. As he said, it was very good when he wanted to think and go walking in the trees. I was told about it by Robert Fort, who also was very important in the history of MDMA. And what Robert said later, he said, you know, I've told a lot of people about microdosing, but Fadiman is the only one who seemed to run with it. So I got excited and interested and began to collect reports. And there's several kinds of evidence. Evidence from scientific laboratories under tightly controlled conditions, variables reduced, et cetera, et cetera. There's also what's called, and this is a technical term now in the literature, real world evidence. And for a pharmaceutical, for example, that's the only final test of whether it's safe and viable. All of the pre-tests that allow it to get licensed by the FDA are much more controlled than real life. The other term for that has been citizen science, which is people reporting information that is useful to other people. And microdosing has, most of the past 10 years, relied almost entirely on citizen science because of the growth of its interest and growth of its use. There's now some really wonderful research going on, and some other research not as wonderful as well, not surprising. The sample that my colleague Sophia Korb and I collected over a few years, about 1,500 reports, were from 51 countries. And so one of the things we learned is that microdosing seems to be a world phenomena, not a kind of West Coast hippie phenomena or a Silicon Valley phenomena. Microdose Me, a group of researchers that have recently published in Science. They had 8,000 people in their first study from 80 countries. So if it ever could be put back in the box, it can't be, okay? Now, conventional science also has put in a lot of reports, mixed results. Some studies show no effect at all. And we may look at that in the panel. But what we're really seeing there is one of the questions now being raised by some of the researchers is how is it that they've been able to do a study that shows no effects or very, very low effects compared with the kind of report that I just read you. And one of the reasons, by the way, is they use predominantly healthy people, so they don't show much improvement in illness-related variables. So what is it used for? What have people used it for? And I'm going to read a list far too quickly for you to get much from it. And this is an old list from a paper that I wrote in 2016, but it was from reports that had piled up, and I was asked to present, and this is the quick list: anxiety, general, social, academic, party anxiety, Asperger's syndrome, more ease in social situations, especially parties, bipolar, mood elevation during depression phase, for some people also disturbing their sleep cycle. One of my favorites is no post-Burning Man crash on returning home. A revelation for the person who first discovered that. There is creativity improvements, technical, coding, machine design, other. There's a decrease in the use of, and this is more common, cigarettes, coffee, Adderall, Vanaxolone, SSRIs, a lot of different pharmaceuticals that people are not happy on and have difficulty getting off. Depression, alleviated depression, like the one I started by reading to you. Ice pick headaches, they're called ice pick headaches because it feels like they've put an ice pick through your eye. It's a cluster headache, which is the worst known pain to human beings, but it lasts a minute. We have a case where it basically, microdosing ended a cluster series in mid pain, and the person has never had them again. Health habits, and we'll look at that a little more: food choices, exercise, yoga, meditation, personal insights that are therapeutic, work-related insights. Learning, a lot of people have used it for learning, and we have cases of learning languages more easily, advanced math more easily. That was actually from a Harvard group. More focused attention in class, and many cases improved grades. Menstrual periods, elimination of PMS symptoms, both physical and emotional, and we have a lot of cases. Emotionally, people, migraines, people don't eliminate, these are chronic migraines. They don't eliminate all migraines, but it goes down 80 to 90% for the people it helps. People have talked about improved physical skills, better on musical instruments, composition, flying a plane, driving. For trauma, people report decreased triggering, less procrastination. A curious one is stuttering. Stuttering, not necessarily overall improvement, but while microdosing, increased ease and fluency, and often normal speech. Better sex or more libido, we're not sure whether it's more libido, whether it's more energy, or more closeness, better communication, etc. But people basically improve sexual relationships. As one report said, if people knew how good this was for sex, you have a real product. For writers, writer's block. For journalists, first drafts, lots of people who then do their first draft of an article about microdosing and indicate how much easier it was. Work in general, improved work, amount of work, discrimination, workflow, quality, etc. A very large group that's over the years more is coming off of psychiatric medications that were deemed not helpful. And this is psychiatric medications, both for depression, SSRIs, etc. And there's lots of high dose work. There's much less, if any, high dose work of helping people come off Adderall, Provigil, and all the other amphetamine drugs. By the way, in college, drugs of choice, probably alcohol is still number one, not sure, but cannabis is number two, and Adderall, etc., is number three. So problem with Adderall is it's a very addicting drug, aside from some other problems. Okay, now, a reasonable question that any of us should ask is how can a few substances like LSD and mushrooms have a positive effect on such a wide variety of conditions? Okay, I'll just give you a couple of possibilities, and that does not exhaust the ones that are out there. One is it's all placebo, it's all expectation, it's all placebo, by the way, means the natural healing response. It's what your body and mind are capable of doing if asked, and perhaps even if tricked. Another possible theory is it's a systemic, like a vitamin. No one asks, is a vitamin good only for one condition? A vitamin improves the functioning of the system. If you think about it, like learning to read is not limited to novels or textbooks or even peer-reviewed journals or erotica. Learn to read is across many possibilities. Another possible site of mechanism or action is mitochondria. Mitochondria are in every cell of the body and they give energy, and over the lifespan, they decline in efficacy. So it may be that something that is helping so many systems may be the underlying possibilities of mitochondria. Now, one of the things that we're looking at is what we call unintended improvements. This is why we say it seems to be systemic. There's people reporting this is not what I microdosed for. However, now after 30 days and reviewing my own notes, I'm aware that I have made changes in my eating habits, my sleep habits have improved. I am doing more exercise or more meditation or both. And I also have a decline in the use of alcohol, caffeine, cannabis, and tobacco. So those are the large groups. Let me give you a few small cases where you have very limited sample. And I say this to get researchers interested perhaps in looking at it for themselves. Cluster headaches. Cluster headaches can be helped with high doses. Lots and lots and lots of evidence. When people write us, we say, no, go to clusterbusters.com for the best information. But a lot of people, several people have written us and said, well, I started with microdosing and my clusters of 4, 5, 8, 10 years duration have gone. And I still microdose when I feel them coming back. Traumatic brain injuries, there's now a whole company, Wisana, one of the psychedelic companies that is interested solely in recovering brain functioning. Traumatic brain injuries, basically we don't have anything to improve the parts of the brain that are damaged. We have a lot of workarounds to help people. It looks like microdosing may be able to do to help the brain literally improve neuroplasticity, improve brain functioning. Some fascinating, I love this because it makes no sense at all in terms of any of the systems I know, which is we have a number of cases where people have had shingles. Shingles, when it is not treated immediately, can lead to intense pain and suffering and open lesions, just generally horrible. And microdosing seems to be helpful in restoring the body's functioning and in handling the pain. It doesn't necessarily, it does help the pain diminish, say, for 12 hours at a time. But the shingles attack takes whatever amount of time it takes. And we have no idea why that should happen. We've got some Lyme cases. A recent report, I was looking at someone with 20 years of eczema who indicated after the first couple of microdoses that literally the cracks in his skin were closing, and he was beginning to not have eczema after 20 years, and his report after several weeks is it's still improving. One that's, again, very curious, insulin, a case where a woman who'd taken the same dose of insulin under medical supervision for 14 years, after microdosing has reduced her insulin 80%. Again, that's good for the researchers that are able to follow that up. And also an interesting case of thyroid supplements, incredibly number of human beings take them. And one has a certain range where your physician says that's about right. This person was all in the range, but still had a lot of the symptoms of not enough thyroid. Microdosing alleviated the rest of those symptoms. So those are the things that I look at in my daily inbox. So what's going on when something appears to be safe, self-regulating, and beneficial? What's going on when there's improved cognitive and physical functioning in healthy individuals? What's going on when there's a restoration of health from many conditions? And the answer is that's what we're exploring, and that's what this symposium is about, and that's what the question of regulation is about. So I'm just putting all the food out on the table, and people will decide what they feel is appropriate to take for themselves. Now, there also is a class of people coming in called Microdose Coaches. And what they report is that they are often very helpful in improving the overall effectiveness of microdosing. This is not similar, if you think about it, macrodoses, all the large dose studies have an enormous amount of personal therapeutic support and individual attention. So it would not be surprising that microdose coaches are helping people. And again, they basically also help people balance to get the correct dose. This is definitely not one size fits all. So the problem, and I think we all are fairly clear about the problem, is this is a Schedule I substance, which means that the government has decided kind of that it's not for you, that it has no value, and particularly no medical value and addictive possibilities. Now, let's be very clear. There's nothing in the literature of psychedelics, high dose or low dose, that justifies that. They were put on Schedule I because President Nixon wanted some way to attack the people he was mad at, which included hippies and war resistors. And this was a wonderful way. By making their drug illegal, you could then arrest them or at least search them. You could wiretap and so forth. As Ehrlichman said when asked about this, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So we're in a peculiar situation where the legal situation, putting psychedelics, which were at the time they were made illegal with, quote, no medical possibilities, they were the most researched psychiatric drug on the planet. When I got interested in this in the early 1960s, I wrote Sandoz, said, are there any papers? I didn't know how to do this. So they sent me 2 volumes of the first abstracts of the first 1,000 papers. So this was hardly an unknown, unstudied, unresearched drug. And at the time of its Schedule I, there were at least 40,000 cases that had been recorded with a high degree of effectiveness, almost all high dose, of course. So what are some of the problems? The problem is mainly, according to surveys, the problem is it's illegal. And the problem is it's hard to get a steady supply. Now, this is not about the substances, you notice. This is only about its legal structure. Those are the primary comments when people say, what is the problem? The World Drug Survey, which has been following microdosing for 4 years, one of the interesting questions is they had a sample, of course, and they said, and a number of people had stopped using. The reasons for stopping using were predominantly no effect, which either was correct or what we would think is too low a dose or too high a dose. So a lot of people were stopping microdosing basically because they didn't have correct information. The limitations that we know of, and I'm sure there are more, include it's not particularly good for anxiety. It seems to be very beneficial for depression, but not for just anxiety. Tinnitus, which is a ringing in the ears, seems to be made worse by microdosing for people who have tinnitus, and a number of people, this is out of the Microdosing Institute in Holland, where we have another group of 4,000 or 5,000 cases. A number of people have reported that when they microdosed, they had tinnitus for the first time in their lives. Now, what we've also found is when they've stopped microdosing, the tinnitus went away. For people who have tinnitus and it got worse with microdosing.
I'm just cutting in here to say this is your 5-minute warning.
Thank you. There's a question of whether their tinnitus will go back to the level it was or maybe even improve. Okay. People shouldn't take it if they're on lithium carbonate, but if we went to a website we keep called microdosingpsychedelics.com, the question is, can I use microdosing with, and then we have a list of 180 substances that people have written in and said, I was on this pharmaceutical, this herb, this medication, and microdosing worked fine. So I recommend looking at that if that's an issue. My favorite problem is red-green color blindness. People who have that, when they microdose, they see what are called tracers, which is after effects of a light. We recommend they don't do it. And some have written it in and said, yeah, it has tracers, but the benefits were worth it. And people who take mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms at any size, sometimes have some stomach discomfort. So the other major problem is misinformation. There's a rumor out there that it is possible that if you took microdosing for many years, you might have a rare heart valve problem. 0 cases for high dose. And since psychedelics were illegal, 40 million Americans have taken them. So we have a reasonably decent sample, but it's out there. And the problem of quality, of course, is very real. And that's unfortunately true with, as you know, now and then when you notice your lettuce has been recalled because it has some terrible bacteria, quality is a problem. It's less of a problem with LSD because you're dealing with millionths of a gram. So, regulation. What's the problem? How do you regulate such small doses? I mean, sometimes is it like regulating aspirin? Or is it more like dental hygiene? When you have a serious problem, you go to a dentist, highly specialized, highly trained. When you want to prevent problems, you go to a less professional, still highly trained hygienist. But toothpaste, kind of the microdose of dental hygiene, is not regulated. The panel, fortunately, Dave on the panel is, whether he likes it or not, one of the world experts on the Oregon regulations, and we'll see. So I wanted to give you one more case, and it's one that just came in and very puzzling, and then we'll call me off. Okay. This is from the Netherlands Microdosing Institute. I'm a 63-year-old male with high blood pressure, suffered a mild stroke a year and a half ago. And if I don't have the right, the one thing I have noticed is an almost complete relief from a decades-old addiction to pornography. Over 30 years, I could literally feel my brain calling for the chemical fix. I hated myself. Since microdosing once every 3 days for approximately 3 weeks, the desire to use porn has completely vanished. I think of it as a past event in my life. I did view it once on purpose to see what would happen, and honestly, it just felt stupid and pointless. If nothing else has been achieved for me for the use of psychedelics, this has been worth it. It's released me from a life of shame and bondage. No idea what to tell you about that, except porn addiction is an incredibly difficult addiction to deal with. And perhaps we have a way into it that none of us ever suspected. So thank you very much for having me with you this morning. And I'm very excited to hear from the panel.
Thank you so much for those framing remarks. I think that it gave the audience a real sense of the potential of microdosing, as well as some of the challenges and understanding, okay, what is it exactly that we have in front of us? For the audience, you'll be able to ask questions. Dr. Fadiman will be involved in the moderated discussion. Speaking of which, I would like to bring our panelists for the moderated discussion to the stage, so to speak, the virtual stage. So if you all could turn on your videos. And as I threatened them, I'm going to have each of them introduce themselves and talk about how they became interested in the issue of microdosing and why they're here as part of this conversation today. And we will go in no particular order beyond how Zoom lists everybody to me. So Dave, if you could introduce yourself first.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dave Coppolak. I'm a business lawyer in Portland, Oregon. I was the primary drafter of Oregon's adult use marijuana measure back in 2014. And our law firm has, over the years, had a lot of cannabis clients. And I was also the primary drafter of Oregon Ballot Measure 109, which passed in November 2020, which was our Psilocybin Services Act. And so I'm following the rulemaking process of that act and looking forward to its implementation next year. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Happy to have you. Then I see Erin, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here. I'm Erin Cerrone. I'm actually a Master of Bioethics degree candidate here at Harvard Medical School. And in my full-time day job, I am an executive in the biotech industry where I work with epigenetics and artificial intelligence to advance human longevity and predict morbidity and mortality outcomes. I'm also on the advisory board of Animal Safe Movement. We're a global NGO focused on animal welfare, and we work very hard to expose and dismantle animal exploitation industries. So all the work that I do really intersects at the nexus of flourishing, both for humans and non-humans, because our fates are deeply intertwined. And my scientific interest in microdosing psychedelics is longstanding, and actually thanks in large part to Dr. Fadiman's work, which was instrumental in understanding how these substances can benefit human flourishing, and in doing so really offer benefit to the planet at large at a time when there's so much suffering and we need it the most. And I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Fadiman back in 2017 at the MAP Psychedelic Science Conference in Oakland. And I remember having this small group lunch with him, and he really opened my eyes to the possibilities of using psychedelics, microdosing specifically for addressing mental health, which is what he was talking about. So I have personal experience with that. And I've really just continued to explore that as a bioethicist in training now, interested in the intersection of ethics and psychedelics.
Thank you, Erin. And I love the term flourishing as the catch-all for all of your many interests. Aoife Tayo, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Aoife Tayo Harvey. I'm the founder of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. I also am the social media manager at Caring Across Generations. I've been in the drug policy reform space since 2013, started off at the Drug Policy Alliance in New York, and also worked for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Also worked for ArcView, and I worked for Drug Policy Alliance for 5 years. I started the People of Color Psychedelic Collective in 2018, And our mission is to educate and build community among folks of color interested in psychedelics and ending the war on drugs.
That sounds like some very necessary but very complicated and heavy work in front of you. Sarah, you are our last panelist to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer of Red Light Holland. Red Light Holland is a Canadian publicly traded company that sells legal psilocybin products in the Netherlands, including microdosing kits that are paired with telecounseling and a journaling app where people can consent to share their data. So we can also do citizen science research. And yeah, my background is cognitive neuroscience. I was researching psychedelics and wrote a paper about this. And it's really exciting to be able to participate in an industry that I didn't know would exist when I was back studying. And that's really brought me into learning so much more about specifically also microdosing, because this is one of the main product offerings that we have in the Netherlands.
Wonderful. So this first section of our discussion, I'm going to call, I guess, what is microdosing in the first place? You know, there's the old chestnut from Supreme Court constitutional jurisprudence that, you know, pornography when you see it. Is microdosing also similar? Like, you know, microdosing when you see it, or how can we get to a consensus on what is microdosing versus macrodosing?
Okay, let me just make it clear. Macrodosing has an amazing number of intense, life-changing effects, as well as an amazing amount of visions, visual distortions, visits from your dead relatives, being eaten alive by anacondas. These are not unusual situations. Microdosing has none of that. It can be defined as without classic psychedelic effects at all. And it has, somebody used the word subperceptual years ago. Unfortunately, it was me. It's a terrible word. What it means is that you notice you've microdosed, but you simply notice it because the world is a little easier. The little things happen better for you. You're kinder. You know, you can tell that you're in a better space. It's not a perceptual shift at all. One can, as they say about many drugs, you can operate heavy machinery. You can also play with your children. You can also, one young man said, I only use it when I have a coding problem. So it has a wide range, none of it similar to classic psychedelics. Thank you.
I'd like to add a few things on that great answer. So the first thing, I think, you mentioned the word classical psychedelics, and I think that is important to notice that we're starting to see the word used in things even like ketamine and MDMA, which are not classical psychedelics, and that's causing a lot of confusion. Some of these substances have a lot higher risk profile than classical psychedelics, and coming from the business industry, it seems a bit like they're trying to ride, you know, the psychedelic excitement, and that's causing confusion in research and also just in the general population. So I think it is important to come to an understanding that when most people talk about microdosing, we are talking about microdosing classical psychedelics that activate the 5-HT2A receptor. And the second thing is what I would love to see, and I think this would really help with regulations, a maximum dose. And I know it's hard because some people, you know, want more and some people want less. But when we're talking about a regulatory framework, saying that there is a maximum that isn't compared to a standard dose, which we don't even have an understanding about that. So having some type of comparison that's saying, okay, it's a 10th or 20th of a standard dose. Standard doses can change a lot. And actually, when you're going to the higher threshold, they change even more because people have different tolerances. Some people want a very, very deep experience. But with microdosing, if we're trying to stay under the hallucinogenic effect, and especially with psilocybin that turns into psilocin that we know might have, we don't have very strong evidence, but it might have effects on our heart. having a maximum dose would be really helpful. So that's something that I think should be really important for us to figure out.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Sarah, we will follow up with what you alluded to, the discussion of the potential risks of microdosing later in the conversation. So definitely put a pin in that because I want to discuss that. But before we get there, I want to pose a question actually from a research affiliate of the Project on Psychedelics Law and Regulation here at the Petrie-Flom Center, Dustin Marlin, Dustin's question essentially boils down to a Goldilocks problem. You know, he says there is a massive difference between a psychedelic macrodose and microdose. And he asks, why does there seem to be no middle ground, i.e. a dose between macro and micro being researched or advocated for?
There's almost no research being done on microdoses either, because it goes over several weeks, and that really frightens a lot of researchers. The middle ground, which is called mini doses, there's one book out by Torsten Passi describing a couple, maybe 40, 50 studies, most of them in Europe, most of them earlier. And the answer is there's just less interest because the effects are neither one nor the other.
And I do think it's worth clarifying for the audience in case anyone isn't thinking about it this way, even though it may seem obvious, is that these are still Schedule I substances. We can have a discussion about the fact that they're misclassified, and I think most folks would make a pretty good argument who are sitting on this panel, but because of the status, it makes it quite difficult to conduct this kind of research. So it's a bit of a catch-22, because on one hand, you have people saying, well, there's no evidence for a mini dose or for a microdose. And then on the other hand, you have difficulty in conducting these studies. There's still stigmatization, difficulty in accessing the product. So it seems obvious, but it is important.
Yeah, let's careful on the word evidence, because if you go to Reddit, for example, there's a sub-edit called Microdosing. It has 195,000 people who share experiences, methods, substances. It's really wonderful. Someone asked a question, and within a couple of hours, 50 people from all kinds of places have answered it. So we have large repositories of what we call real-world evidence. We don't have large repositories of laboratory-derived evidence. For one reason, they're hard to do, they're expensive, and because it's Schedule I, the government makes it incredibly more difficult to do very simple research. That's why a lot of research is now coming out of Holland, because as they say, it's easy for us, it's inexpensive, and we just ask for volunteers to help, which lowers the cost. So we're getting our data not from science first, we're getting it from science later.
So under Oregon's Act, allows for clients, that's a terminology, a client can consume psilocybin at a service center, which is a physical location, under the supervision of a facilitator, which is a human being who is sort of supervising the client's psilocybin experience. The Act itself we didn't define the term microdose or macrodose or anything like that. The Act delegates the issue of dosage to the regulatory agency, which is the Oregon Health Authority. So they're grappling with that right now. The Act does require the Oregon Health Authority to set a maximum dosage for a single serving. But there's no minimum dosage, and we highly doubt the Oregon Health Authority will have some sort of minimum dosage. So I suspect it's almost a free market here, I think, is going to dictate what the dosages are. And I suspect, and I don't pretend to know anything about the benefits of a mini dose versus, if there's no middle ground there at all. But I suspect, there will be a spectrum of products ranging from a microdose to the maximum allowable macrodose, and probably a whole bunch of dosages in between there. And so that's we haven't defined it in the act. From a lawyer's perspective, from a statute's perspective, definitions are super important. And so far, there's no definitions because there hasn't been a need for any. And the idea is that the facilitators will work with the clients to come up with something that makes sense for that client in that circumstance. And a lot of folks think that there should be sort of maximum discretion within that area. And so that's the way the system is set up in Oregon with respect to dosage. So far, rules are being developed and discussed, and that'll come out by the end of this year. But right now, we are a definition-less statute at the moment when it comes to dosage.
So, Dave, I want to pull out something that you said, which is, we haven't needed really to have a definition of microdosing yet, but with measures such as Measure 109 in Oregon, as it becomes more and more available to people, there may be that need. And you were like, the facilitators will sort of work to develop it. I think one very interesting thing about Dr. Fadiman's remarks was the role of citizen science to date here. What do you see, and you, the entire panel, as the strengths and weaknesses of the information that we have and going the citizen science route? And, we can't be too rigid. We need to meet people where they are, versus a more medical research model of learning about microdosing.
Well, Oregon's Act is non-medical. This is really an amazing aspect of the Act. A client does not need to have any medical conditions or preconditions whatsoever. You have to be 21 years of age, and there will be some sort of screening process, but you don't have to have a mental health condition to participate. You don't have to have any reason at all. You can just feel like doing it. Likewise, the facilitators don't need to be medical health professionals. This is a sort of a new type of licensed profession that we invented to sort of supervise an experience. And the facilitators themselves, the only requirements are that they have a high school, they've graduated high school or equivalent, and they take a course. So there will obviously be a sort of a training course and an examination to pass, and then you are a licensed facilitator. And now there are a whole slew of already licensed professionals, like psychologists and physicians and naturopaths and a whole bunch of other folks who appear to be very interested in becoming facilitators. And so you're going to have this really interesting merging of, in some cases, merging of mental health professionals with facilitators. But at its base level, a facilitator is a non-medical thing. And so that's really interesting, I think. And so, not to get too deep into the act, but the Oregon Psychology Board has come out, just like the Oregon State Bar would come after somebody who was practicing law without a law license. The Oregon Psychology Board has observed, rightfully so, that, hey, if you have facilitators there who are not licensed psychologists who are practicing psychology while they're facilitating, like, that's not okay. You're practicing psychology without a license. So you're in this interesting situation where all of these other professions, you have to look at what the definition of practicing psychology is, what the definition of practicing medicine is, and the bare bones facilitators won't be able to do that. So the way I've described it is the act is non-medical, but it's not anti-medical in the sense that medical professionals can participate in the act too. So really unique stuff.
Oregon may be interested in that there are now, there's an international microdosing coaching association, about 8 countries. The Netherlands Institute trains coaches for microdosing. There are American coaches. So there's some interesting models that Oregon might look at. I love that the psychology people would like to stop people from practicing psychology. I suppose that would mean if one of us says to the other, you know, do you think this has anything to do with your childhood? Does that put us up for legal processing? I doubt it. So, but it's nice that psychology is trying to hang in there. By the way, my degree is in psychology. I don't have a license, okay? So I don't have a stake in the game of licensure.
You know, this is a question that I think about in other aspects of my work, where I look at digital technology products, a lot of which are labeled as general wellness products. So they're outside of medical device regulation, but at the same time, it sometimes feels like the companies putting them forward are trying to have their cake and eat them too, because they talk about how they're going to improve your wellness. And it can sometimes become difficult for consumers to understand the difference between wellness and health. And here, and I think I would like Erin as somebody who I think is very immersed in the health tech world. So I think she like understands what I'm talking about here, to reflect on a lot of the framing of microdosing is about the health, the medical benefits. If you take this, it will address your depression that has been treatment resistant, or it'll address your incredibly painful cluster headaches. And I'm wondering the tension between saying, all right, the right regulatory model in this space is one that is adult recreation or adult use, sorry, not recreation. That is a misspeak on my part, but adult use, adults can make their own choices about what experiences to have, what experiences are important to them. When some of the framing, especially to people who are not immersed in psychedelics issues, is, oh, well, this is a medication for mental health or pain, just as you might take an SSRI, but it'll work better than an SSRI. So Erin, I'm handing that over to you.
Thank you for that very big question. I'm going to do my best to address it from my perspective, and I'd love to hear other folks chime in as well. This is a big one, right? And it really intersects with this idea that we talk about in almost all bioethical frameworks, which is this pursuit of human flourishing. You could extend that to non-human flourishing, planetary flourishing, but we'll talk here about human flourishing. And in the digital symposium, which you guys have over on your Bill of Health blog, I believe the title of my piece is, restricting access to microdosing is morally wrong. That's my personal opinion. That does not mean, though, that we shouldn't put certain safeguards in place. There shouldn't be punitive laws. And so a first important step, obviously, is looking towards legalization, regulation, destigmatization, maybe something like emergency use authorization. That's more outside of my realm of work and thinking, and probably Dave and Jim can speak to that better. But as someone who works in biotech, look, how you communicate to the consumer is really, really important. So people need to understand what we know about microdosing, what we think that it can do, what we think that it can't do, what empirical evidence exists, which includes the evidence that Jim mentioned, of which there is abundant evidence, maybe some would say more on the anecdotal side or coming from the citizen science community, and then evidence, clinical evidence as well. And how are those meeting out, and how should we be communicating this to people? We certainly should not be making promises if those promises aren't backed up by anything. However, people are suffering. I have a whole bunch of statistics in my blog entry, and this is probably not surprising to anyone who's on the panel or who's listening, but SSRIs, they can be effective. They do not work for everyone. There are remission rates that are fairly significant. And so, my position is that if this is a fairly low risk intervention, as we know it to currently be, and if it can alleviate intractable pain, treatment resistant depression to any degree, then it's absolutely morally wrong to withhold that from people. Certainly it's wrong to withhold the information so that people can better explore it. So I don't know if that begins to answer your question, but I do think that the words we use are very important, and continuing to acknowledge the evidence that Jim mentioned and not sort of brush it to the side because it wasn't conducted in a manner that comports with what the scientific community is used to. Perhaps we need to expand that paradigm a bit. I'm also not saying that there aren't risks and that we shouldn't pursue, safe administration as well.
I'd love to add to that as somebody who builds these digital tools, including what you're seeing behind me is a clip from a virtual reality experience that teaches people what psychedelics do to their brain, and is deployed in some smart shops in the Netherlands so people can actually learn what these substances are doing to them. So I can only speak about what we personally do, which is being very careful, no claims, but trying to give people tools around mindfulness, around connecting to expert therapists and the community to help them identify what is working for them, what isn't working for them, how they should, the protocol, the dosage, and trying to collect more data around this for people who are willing and consenting to share their data. I think that is a very important part of creating these digital tools. As we know, a lot of them, if you're looking at just normal social media, they collect everything just to push advertisements on us. And that from a technologist perspective is one of the most important things for me, is to respect people's privacy, give them the tools that they need, and if they want to participate in research, help them do that. So that's what we're trying to do, again, with no claims, but trying to understand what people are using it for. And for instance, in our research, we found that the younger generation especially is actually using this for help in focus. And I think that's something that hasn't been researched enough. There's a lot of stimulants out there that have absolutely terrible side effects if we're looking at Adderall. And if microdosing has the possibility to help some of these people, it's great to collect more data about it. It's great to know and actually promote. So this is more connected to your previous question, right? Where citizen science can help focus the clinical research, the lab research. If we're seeing these types of effects in the wider population, let's figure out how to do a more controlled research around specific topics.
I would add one thing to that as well. This is, we could go down this rabbit hole for a very long time, but and I brought this up in the blog as well. It's very important to consider features like access and equity. And we think about this in the sector I work in for my day job as well, right? Who is going to be able to access this technology? Are there any issues of, what does justice look like here? And because we're talking about flourishing health and well-being, it's really important to consider those things. So what we don't want to happen is to have those participant pools really skewed towards folks who have maybe, a little more privileged, have access to more information, maybe are more educated. I'm making these things up. It could be a number of features, but there is that danger as well, in that we don't want to exclude people and perpetuate existing forms of oppression that are already there in society and in healthcare anyway.
One of the nice things about microdosing is two things. One is, and I think we can all agree on this, mushrooms do not know they're illegal. And they grow pretty much everywhere. There are over 100 species of psilocybin around the planet. One of my favorite places to find them, by the way, is the landing strip at the Vancouver airport between the planes, for example. Also courthouses. So they're around. The other question is, to what extent do you need professional help, meaning additional cost? And that's, it turns out, very low. The actual cost of a dried mushroom, enough for a microdose, is more like 25 cents before pharmaceuticals get hold of it. So we're dealing with actually a very low cost, a very potentially widely available set of substances that will be difficult to regulate because they're widely available and someone under the effects shows no symptoms. And by the way, there's nothing that they can really measure either. If you're pulled over and say, are you microdosing? And you say, you guess, copper. The answer is there's no tests at the moment that's very good. So we're dealing with it with the other curious problem is these seem to be helpful according to the thousands of reports for people who have no medical conditions at all. And as you know, the medical system is not designed, there is no category for wellness. It's simply a different world. And microdosing cuts across both worlds. And I very much like the notion that microdosing should have a cap. You know, what's a microdose, and have a number. And then the groups who are specialized and need a different amount will request under equity and justice that they need a different amount, for example. That's the people on the autism spectrum need a higher amount, and we have lots of data. Things like that. So there are a lot of problems that are unusual because it's very inexpensive. It has very few effects that we can notice, and it affects both wellness and illness. And it doesn't fit easily into categories. And one of the things that's wonderful about Oregon is the Oregon proposition says, we don't have categories. We just say we're regulating people's ability to use it safely and effectively. I think that's correct, Dave? Is that?
That's right.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I want to build on actually something that Aaron said and something that Jim said. You know, Aaron brought up, we don't want to just throw microdosing on the pile of many other health wellness interventions, the social benefits of which are accessed unequally and recreate systems of oppression. Like, that's not a great outcome. We can all agree. And Jim, you know, you're talking about these substances are not expensive. To procure, they can be accessible from that metric. But I think until very recently, it hasn't been so much the cost as that until very recently, we've said, okay, the way that we regulate psychedelics, be it macro or microdosing, is going to be the criminal justice system. And that has sat very heavily, I think, with communities of color. And so to see this shift to a more accessible model, but a model that I think we'll get into a moment discussing the economics of, I think must be really interesting in your work, Ifetayo, and you must have a lot of reflections of, are we going along the right path, or are we recreating issues and biases that we don't want to bring along with us on this journey?
Well, I'll say, firstly, when we talk about legalizing or decriminalizing, regulating psychedelic substances, we have to reckon with the fact that the medical community has had a history of upholding the war on drugs, right? They've had a history of upholding criminalization. In New York State, pregnant mothers, you know, as they're giving birth, they are drug tested. If they test positive for things like cannabis, they face having their children taken away, right? And so we also have to reckon with that history and the fact that drug laws in America are not enforced in the same way. And obviously that's shaped by race. Back in 2013, the ACLU released a report on marijuana arrests across the country. And it showed that on average, Black people were 4 times as likely to be arrested for using cannabis, even though white folks and Black folks use cannabis at the same rates, right? So I think that we have to be careful about kind of relying on the medical establishment to legitimize what we already know, right? Like Dr. Fadiman said earlier, we have all these users reports on Reddit, Arrowwood, that already tell us what we need to know. I don't think that we need more research to know that people should not be criminalized for using substances, right? I think we need more research to learn, you know, the ins and outs of the effects of microdosing, things like that. But we don't need research to tell us that people should not be thrown in prison or in jail for using a substance, right? That does more harm than good, and prohibition has limited the amount of research that we can do on these substances, so much so that we can't even come up with a consensus on what microdosing is. I've had friends who they take 3.5 grams of mushrooms and they're like, I didn't feel anything. And I'm like, whoa, that's like a pretty sizable dose for someone like me. So there's lots of research that needs to be done. We have a lot of catching up to do. I think in terms of not replicating those, forms of oppression, we have to make it as accessible as possible. I really like what you said earlier, Dr. Fadiman, about, how you like picking mushrooms at courthouses or at the airstrip in Seattle or Vancouver. And yeah, I think we don't need to, we don't need to make it so that mushrooms or other substances are so expensive or so out of reach that the average person can't afford it. I think that there's something to be said about, in terms of cannabis legalization, a lot of policies have the home grow aspect written in them. I think it would be interesting to see how that plays out in a lot of these like decrim nature initiatives or similar things going on around the country, because mushrooms are relatively easy to grow. So I think it's really about putting it in the hands of the people and giving the people the right education and information so they can make their own empowered decisions to keep themselves safe.
So access and affordability and equity are really important. That's a very challenging thing that's going on in the Oregon Act. The Oregon Health Authority and our governor, everyone's pushing for that, but it's a very challenging thing to do when you're in a commercially licensed system. So I mentioned how nobody thinks the Oregon Health Authority is going to set a minimum dose. So legally there will be microdoses allowed, but the question is, and this goes to equity and accessibility, will it be kind of a commercially, will it make any sense under the Oregon system, both from a client's perspective and from a service center's perspective? The system is set up so that it follows a therapeutic model in the sense like the facilitator and the client have to meet before anything happens for a preparation session. So some conversation has to take place, and there's going to be a client information form that gets filled out. And once somebody's okay with moving forward, they'll go to the administration session. But they have to drive into the service center, or they have to get to the service center, consume the microdose on site, stick around for some period of time, and that's going to be another interesting issue is when an administration session can end. At what point does the facilitator say, okay, you're good to go home, and then has to come back however many days later, 2 or 3 days later, to do the same thing again. And so I think that the Oregon Health Authority, there's a multitude of rules that they could promulgate that would just, from a practical perspective, quash microdosing, even though it would be legally permissible. They could say, you can't have 2 administration sessions within a certain period of time, which would just, crush it. They could say that an administration session has to last at least 3 hours long, or they could say they could come up with any kind of things that would make it it wouldn't make sense. Now,
are you saying?
Go ahead.
One thing that comes to mind as you're discussing this is whether there needs to be a different regulatory approach to macro and microdosing, or if the regulatory system needs to be sophisticated enough to understand the difference between the two.
Well, that is what is within that's within the OHA's, Oregon Health Authority's, power right now. I mean, they're figuring it out. If they come up with rules that, as a practical matter, make microdosing impossible under the statute, number one, I think equity and affordability will take a hit, because if you're I mean, the cost of macrodosing, you know, to purchasing a product, which is probably the lowest part of the cost, but you know, going into a service center, hiring a facilitator for an 8-hour session. I mean, somebody has to make money in that in that thing, and somebody's paying money, and nobody has, you know, federal health benefits to cover this stuff. So if you're talking that, you know, if a session is going to, if you set up a system where you almost can't have a session for less than $1,000, who's going to do that? I mean, I might do it, but who else? There's a whole bunch of folks in society who just, they're going to be excluded from the system. So the health authorities really, I think, trying to push towards, so I am optimistic that they will come up with something that will be affordable. At the same time, safety is paramount, and we're the first state to go. And the worst thing that can happen is that a bunch of bad things happen from a publicity safety standpoint, and it kind of moves the whole movement back a step, I think. So obviously you're balancing safety, affordability, and equity, and just commercial viability from a standpoint of a service center. So, and nobody knows what the market's going to look like. Nobody knows how many service centers there's going to be, how many facilitators are going to be, what the demand's going to be. So the market is like, nobody knows. And so from a business standpoint, it's liable to be very volatile in the beginning, and we'll see how things shake out. And you know, as long as we launch the program and things don't go off the rails too much, I think folks will be keen to adapt and to see, hey, this is good. This is looking like it's really expensive. I would hope that we could promptly kind of, you know, modify things to turn. But the good news is it's within the Oregon Health Authority's authority to regulate the dosage, and we don't need to go back to the legislature to amend the statute. It's within their power right now to make it very affordable. And an example is that they're talking about group sessions. And so you could imagine a facilitator, or let's say a microdose that is not hallucinogenic, you know, sub-hallucinogenic, whatever the correct term is, where you have a group of folks go into the service center. You have some pretty high ratio. Who needs a facilitator that much for a microdose? And how long would that take? So you could, I mean, I suppose some folks might think like some sort of assembly line of people going in all day long at 25, you know, clients a shot who pop in and out in 3 minutes is looking awfully like a dispensary, and that might ruffle some folks' feathers. But you could also imagine a system where it makes sense, where you have 5 or 10 clients to a facilitator. Everybody goes in, hangs out for whatever, 10, 15, 30 minutes. It's not killing your whole day. And then you can do that 2 or 3 times a week, and it's very affordable because you're only paying for one facilitator. Everybody's paying 1/10 of the facilitator's cost. So a system could be set up. It remains to be seen whether that will happen. And that is, you know, those rules are going to come out in the next 6 months. And there's a lot of folks who are very interested in how that plays out.
So I see Aoife Tayo like nodding her head. You do not have a poker face. You're like into what Dave is saying. And, you know, as he ended his comments, 6 months out, we're going to get these new rules. What's on your wish list to see come out of the Oregon Health Authority? Like when that gets released, and you open the report, what would make you incredibly happy to see in there?
Oh man, that's a really great question. I think Dave touched on this a little bit in terms of the affordability and the cost. I would love to see, you know, I understand that folks have to get paid and make a living, but I would love to see something like a sliding scale or something that says like, okay, if you're in this income bracket, you only have to pay this amount of money. I think that's something that would be, I mean, and y'all may already have something like that, but I would love to see something like that applied, because when you said $1,000, I know that would deter a lot of people from doing it. And then the other thing is that in America, you know, a lot of our policies that we don't have a federal paid leave policy. We don't have federal sick time policies. So the fact that, you know, only a certain segment of the population can, hey, take PTO or take sick leave, that's an issue. And when you talk about macrodosing, like, who has 6 to 8 hours to take off of work to commit to a mushroom journey? A lot of folks don't have that time. So I would love to see, yes, something as simple as like a sliding scale that will really meet folks where they are in terms of affordability.
So, Sarah, I see that you have your hand raised and you're going to go next, but I'm probably going to blow up what you have to say because I also have a question for you based on your blog post. And here I may ask you to become an impromptu professor of pharmacokinetics. Because in your blog post, Sarah, as you said, okay, let's talk about what microdosing is or what the definition should be. You reference that there is some evidence that of a theoretical concern for heart damage if you use psilocybin. And I would love for you to kind of walk us through it and explain to the audience what that kind of storm cloud on the horizon of like, this can really help people and really help end suffering might be.
Sure. I just, before that, would like to still address what Dave said about understanding the market, because we did put out very extensive market research in Oregon to understand the market. And we also wrote a report, so I can post it in the chat, sent it to the OHA. And we are seeing 16% of adults in Oregon wanting to microdose on a weekly basis, 30% wanting to microdose on a monthly basis, with the lower income brackets being able to pay $50 for a session. So we actually have a pretty good idea of what is required to make this accessible and based on what people want. And regarding the group sessions, I think that is the big question. I personally think the rest of the loopholes, we'll be able to figure it out. Because if you need to do, nobody's gonna force somebody to stay in session longer than they want to. They can't do that. So if somebody, even though the session is supposed to be longer and they want to leave earlier, what are they going to do? Lock them in the doors? That's not going to happen. But the group sessions, that's what's going to make it affordable or not. If you need one-on-one supervision, that's still going to make it more expensive. And that's why we are actually creating I think one of the first, or maybe even the first group microdosing event in the Netherlands is going to happen over the weekend, with some of the participants willing to be part of the research in a group setting while listening to classical music and having this connection ritual to try to actually show Oregon, this is a model. It's working in places where it's legal. Please let us do this in Oregon too, because this is the way to actually help more people and create a more equitable solution. So that's about just the previous question. Now, the safety issue is really only about regular usage, right? If we're talking about one-off use of microdosing, even using it once a week, there really is no real concern. But when we look at a drug that was called fen-phen, it activated the 5-HT2B receptor, which turns out that psilocin, which is what psilocybin turns into after we eat it, activates that same receptor. Now, activating that receptor, the 5-HT2B receptor, continuously has been shown to create a heart valve damage. It thickens the heart valve, and that can be dangerous. So we had, not me, I'm not a I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, but we brought in a chemist to actually look at the numbers and come out with a comparison. And the comparison that they came up with is 6 milligrams of psilocin, which is more or less the same as the psilocybin, because every psilocybin molecule breaks into psilocin. There's a tiny, tiny bit of a weight difference there, but that would be equivalent to that fen-phen drug. And that's why we think there should be a max that is has a safety measure under that 6 milligram. So anything that is under that 6 milligram would be much safer. And we're actually seeing drug trials with fen-phen again in the dose of 27 milligrams. And that's been shown currently. There's been research with 3 and 6 months after using that drug continuously that is not showing any damage. So as long as you stay around that dose, and I'm not a medical doctor, but that is the chemical comparison, that's what we see in research. And that's why I think it is important, because some people like autism spectrum, or we're seeing people with headaches, cluster headaches, might want to microdose regularly in a stronger dose. And at least for them, I think it's important to have much closer supervision. If they are going to be using doses that get closer to 6 milligrams, they should really be careful and get supervision to see that their heart isn't being damaged.
So we have 4 minutes left, and I want to end on a framing question that I would love each of our panelists to answer. In 5 years, where do you see microdosing, and where do you hope to see it?
I guess I'll go. 5 years. I would like to see microdosing be a viable, affordable option under the Oregon Act. That it becomes just easily accessible and affordable, and anyone who wants to do it can do it. And then I would also like to see other states. Again, the Oregon Act is sort of this in-between thing between criminal prohibition, decriminalization, and the medical clinical system. So I'd like to see the Oregon model, not necessarily exactly as it is, but proliferate, just like legalization of cannabis did among the states, and have this sort of avenue, this optional avenue to psilocybin, and even perhaps beyond psilocybin to more psychedelics. So I'm hoping that Oregon is the first step in this thing that will proliferate and give access to people.
I can go next. Yeah, I believe we will be seeing microdosing centers within 5 years, especially on the West Coast, a place where instead of even doing your morning coffee, you can go in, do a microdose, have a preparation session, do yoga, build a healthy habit, meditate, and then go and do your work. What I'm hoping to see is even more than that. 5 years, we might even see broader legalization that allows people to do these substances in their homes. My hope there would be we can use educational efforts. And I keep saying, like a personal license. Have a bit like a driver's license. Study the material, do a little test. If you understand what this is doing for you, if you understand harm reduction, microdosing is a lot less dangerous than alcohol, right? There's absolutely no doubt about that. So why can't we give adults the ability to also do this in their homes? That might be more on the 10-year scale, but if we push for it, maybe we get to that in 5 years.
I'll go next, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I'm perhaps as an American, I'm not so convinced that in 5 years we'll see anything even close to a rescheduling. But I do think that because of the work that people like Dave are doing, that we will see more and more jurisdictions decriminalizing, telling police, hey, just deprioritize this, which will hopefully open up access. But from my perspective, what I really hope to see is an expansion of education, destigmatization campaigns. We spoke a lot about, awareness and expanded access and equity. So I really hope that as, we begin to implement microdosing, that we can create a framework for using it that addresses these existing structural injustices, particularly in the United States in healthcare, because it's just so important.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Erin. I was thinking similarly. I hope that yeah, I hope that there's obviously more decriminalization, legalization, less punishment for people who are using substances. And I hope that as microdosing catches on and more people learn about it, that we can use it as a tool to improve the lives of people across our country and across the world.
So right now, we do have one country where we can see how deregulation works, which is in Holland. One can purchase microdoses or macrodoses as an adult. One can get information as an adult. One can take them with or without other people as an adult. There are coaches and support groups and therapists for people who feel that's the need. And I would be amazed that the United States could move towards that kind of normal, sensible behavior. But remember, we started this by pointing out there was never any reason that psychedelics were made illegal in the first place. It's very hard to get people to get that, because once it became illegal, the medical profession said, well, if it's illegal, there must be reasons. And then they began to create reasons. The other thing is we only have a few thousand years. I think indigenous people, for instance, should automatically get a pass, because if you've used a substance, let us say, for over 500 years, that you shouldn't be caught in the American legal version of the day. And I just looked at a little list from Charcuna, the South American information source, that was listing 120 different tribes that use ayahuasca. It's not rocket science, and it's very hard. As remember, we're the country that did prohibition for alcohol and managed with enormous success to move from a beer and wine country to a hard liquor country, because it was beneficial for criminals to be able to have compressed alcohol in higher and higher doses. We've learned how to do it wrong with alcohol. We learned how to do it wrong with cannabis. We learned to do it wrong with psychedelics. There are models already for all of those that work pretty well. So I'm not sure if I'm optimistic or pessimistic, but there's going to be a whole lot of action in the next 5 years. Okay, and I'm just thrilled with the level of concern and sophistication that we already have.
It is definitely an exciting time. One thing that I would like to highlight, audience, your questions have been so amazing. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to address them all. A very interesting theme throughout the questions was a lot of questions saying, can you let me know the research on microdosing and cluster headaches, on stacking different substances to achieve microdosing, on the impact of microdosing on parents and caregivers as they're actively caregiving. And I think all of those are amazing questions. And I think probably a lot of the panel would say we have some evidence, but like we need to know more. And I think we just stand at such an interesting pivot point where hopefully in the next 5 years, we will learn a lot more about microdosing and what it can and can't achieve, as well as what does it look like to start moving away from prohibition and truly embracing other regulatory systems, such as the Oregon model, to say people are adults and they can make choices about improving their health and wellness and mental health overall. So I'm very interested to see what unfolds in the future. And in the meantime, thank you all for such an interesting and thoughtful discussion. And thank you for answering some of our attendees' questions. For those of you, obviously you're all in the Zoom, but I'm sure you have friends who are like, oh, I wish I could have attended that panel, but I just had a conflict. We will be posting this video once we get it fully captioned. It'll probably take us 1 to 2 weeks. If you or your friend who missed the panel were registered for this event, you'll be getting an email saying, hey, we finally got it up. It's posted for everybody to access. So once it is, please share this conversation with all of your friends. And again, a big thank you to our panel. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Well, thank you from the center, and thank you Harvard, as I say, I didn't think we'd be invited back in this century. And clearly we're moving forward, and it's groups like this that are going to make the serious difference in the regulatory community.